thank you guys. Thank you for being here. And I'm really proud to be here and happy to be here and excited to be here. So I'm gonna make a flower. It's kind of like an anemone flower. It's not a very complex flower, but it has all of the kind of parts, and you could go a lot farther with it. I'm gonna do it in clear. I like making flowers. If I do them in color and kind of full to a full flower of what I do, they take a really long time. So within the 2-hour demo, what I've done is I made most of the prep work that I need. So I have petals, and then I have these kind of bundled little bits of what would be stamen. Because I'm going to use 6 petals. I probably will use about 15 of these things, but I just don't have time to make it all and make the flower. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a petal or 2. I'm going to make a stamen bundle or 2 so you can see what I did to get there. But then I'll go right into assembling the flower without. I like to have extras so you can see, or maybe you can't see, but I have 9 petals here. I'm only going to use 6, and I'm going to make 2 more. But it never hurts to have extras in case one breaks or I drop one or something happens. If I have to stop in the middle of the process and go back to petal making, that can be a drag. So I always like to have extras, same the way I have extras of these guys. Sometimes I pick them up and maybe decide, well, I don't want to use that one. So as long as I have enough to get done what I want to do. Also, for some reason, I forgot my glass that I brought to make my demo. It's in my hotel luggage. So I've got these other bits of glass, mostly close to what I would use, but it's going to be a little bit different. And I think I can pull it off, but it might be a little awkward at moments, at least in my mind. So I'm going to ask you guys to, this is something that I do a lot. Not necessarily this flower, although I did, the reason I'm doing them is because I did a commission. I made about 80 of these in November. So they're still a little fresh. Not that fresh, but I made a couple last week too, so I'm not scared or anything. But please ask me questions if you feel like asking questions about anything you want. I'm pretty good at talking and working at the same time. So just shout it out if you got it. I also forgot my shears. Hopefully I won't need them. I would only really use them for this process if, like, when on the stamens, when I'm finishing those, I'm going to ball up the end of each one so it's in a little ball. If those balls touch each other when they're hot, then they're stuck, and I don't like them to be stuck. So at that point, I would go in and try to heat up below them and snip them free of each other. But if I can, mostly if these guys are set up right, then the stamens aren't really that close to each other, and they can all ball up without contacting. So I guess I'll just start with making one of these little bundles. I need to pull out some stringer so that I can make those, and I'll do that real quick. And then I'll get into make a petal. I may just make 1 petal instead of 2, but you'll see the whole process. It's a blown petal. Then I'm going to open it with the flame and my blow hose, which is something that Sally Prash taught me. You guys probably know of Sally Prash. I was working at Pilchuck as the flame shop coordinator, and I was over there at my space making flowers. And at that point, I was heating up solid rod and then flattening it with a masher to make the petal. And she saw me and she was like, "Oh, no, you can't do it like that. They're way too thick. I'm going to show you how to make a blown petal." And then she stopped everything she was doing and showed me how to do this. And that has been really great for me because I use it a lot for petals and for leaves and anything that I want to be thin. I do like to work kind of from nature, and I'm a big nature guy. I think it's really important, obviously, because we live and breathe and drink and everything behind nature. So that was really awesome, and I thought it was really generous of her to just kind of stop her class. I wasn't in her class, I hadn't paid to be there. I was doing something else, but she thought I needed to learn that, and I did. And she took the time out of what she was doing for her job to show me how to do what I do better. And that's always been, something that I thought was really generous. So I always thank her before I demo that technique. She also taught me this other thing too. I was there, and one of the kids in the class came up to me, and they had a piece of rod with some kind of stuff on the end of it. And they were like, well, how do I get this off? And I said, oh, you just take it to the bucket and you hit it real hard on the bucket, and the thing will fall off. And the person looked really shocked or whatever, and Sally came running over, and she was like, no, that's not trash, that's the piece. And I felt really bad. It's good to think before you speak sometimes. And that's something, it's been really a big part of my experience, was being at Pilchuck as a student and as a teaching assistant for Roger Paramore, who I've worked with a lot, and then on the staff at the Flameworking studio, is that I really got to meet and watch work. Pretty much everyone that I wanted to, that I thought I needed to see them work, I got to see them work for an extended period of time and really learn a lot. I never got to watch Paul teach up there because he never taught during my time, but having been able to see so many people do so many different things really kind of. And then also there's the hot shop and the cold shop and the casting shop. So all these kind of things made me really think about glass in a bigger way maybe than I was used to, which was heat the glass on the torch and do that. But sometimes if you want to make something, this might not be the best way to make the thing. If you want to make if I want to pull out a 7-foot long optic molded tube of glass, that's not really practical. You could probably do it on the lathe and then something, but in the furnace you just dip it up, stuff it and puff it, stretch it out. It really makes sense to do it that way. So I always try to, when I want to make something, I want to make it in the way that makes the most sense, and that being, cheapest, easiest, quickest. Those aren't the kind of goals that I'm after. When I think about making my work, what can I make that's really cheap and fast? It's not like that. But when I think about what I want to make, a lot of times it's going to be expensive and long. So anything I can do to minimize that and make my life easier on myself and still make my work, give it the most chance of being successful, and I try to find those opportunities and take them wherever I can. So I'm just going to get a real small flame, and I'm going to show you guys what this is. I don't know if you can focus on that. So it's 3 pieces. I just start the one piece, I make a bend, I tag it, make another bend, tag, and then I'll bridge and gather the little tip. And then I leave it on this little handle so I can pick it up and then apply it to the piece, and also this little handle will become my bridge. So I don't have to put the thing on and then get another piece and make a bridge. It's all just kind of happening at the same time. I do use a lot of bridges, especially for botanical type stuff. It's important to make the work well, because you can get the glass stuck on the other piece of glass, but particularly with boro, if you want it to be stuck there well and not just cold sealed on there, but you want a nice full fuse, and then I want a nice full pretty fuse that's really clean. The bridge really makes that possible by immobilizing the parts. So then rather than have to hold them in place or worry about them moving, they're just right where they need to be. This is a little bit tricky. So now I've got them kind of like all bent up to where the parts are close to each other. I'm going to hold that, leave a little bit of extra, and then gather that back to make the connection between the three parts. And I have to leave enough material here to make my weld onto the flower, but I don't like to have lots of, big lump of extra material. I want just as much material as I need to make the connection strong and clean, but not ugly. But it's good to, it's easier to take some off than to add some, especially where, parts are coming together. I don't really want lots of different surfaces and bits of glass combined. They don't flow well together. So if I were to add a little extra glass and then heat it back down, when I stretched that out, it just wouldn't flow the same way as if it was kind of one piece of glass. So if I leave a little extra, I can always take some off. And you'll see when I start to add these parts to the flower, I'll be taking a little bit of extra off of most of them. But that does a couple things. It allows me to get the heat up where I need to without worrying about melting the little stringer parts. I'm going to put a little curve on this. And I'm working way out in the feather and in the very there's a lot of heat out there, and I don't need a lot of heat because I'm working, glass that's less than 1 millimeter thick. But I don't want it to, I can just, if I put it near that or in that actual flame, everything would just happen so fast, it would go south and I wouldn't really be able to keep up with it. So, I'm going to use about probably 15 of these guys. This is one. I'm not going to make another unless y'all want to see me do that again. I'm going to take that as a no, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to go into making a petal. So the petal is a blown bubble, really simple. If I were making, a piece that wasn't clear, there's a lot of different ways to color that bubble. From powdering to, sometimes I powder, sometimes I gather some solid color, put it on the open end of a tube and blow that out. Sometimes I make cane and kind of stack them like a cane roll-up and then close that down and use that for a bubble. And I'm in this weird place with my eyesight where I'm it hurts my brain to wear my prescription glasses and work up close like this, but then when I switch to the non-prescription, you all look blurry. So I'm going to be switching my glasses back and forth. So if you're wondering why I do that, it's because my eyes are getting old. So I'm going to close this tube down. So that I can heat up the end and blow it out into a bubble. I try to, when I take anything apart and I'm making scrap, I don't pull it out really far and make a lot of stringer. That can be kind of hazardous to my hands. I leave everything so that when I'm done and it's cool, I can just pick it up without worrying about hurting myself and throw it in the can. And I don't throw it in the can hot because in my studio I do a lot of different things and I don't want to have 50 trash cans for different things, so I throw everything in the same trash can. And that's why I don't throw anything hot in my trash can. And I don't have a crack off bucket. I don't like them. They're messy. I don't have a sink in my shop, and I don't like to pour out glass, water, and then worry about it. So this way, it's real nice for me. I pick up the big bits, I throw them in the can, and then I vacuum the bench, and it's done. And I don't sweep because I don't like to raise up the little bits in the air for me to breathe them. These are just probably too much information. You guys probably both use blow hoses and pull points here, I'm guessing, or do you pull points?
Yes.
Yeah? I'm a student of Rogers, so I don't pull points. And if you wanna have an argument about that, you can talk to him. But for me, I don't do it for all of his reasons, but I don't talk about it either, unless you want to ask, you know. Well, this doesn't break in my hand. It's really strong, and also it's really uniform. It's round and it's straight. So my hand is always turning something that's round and straight and strong. And also my blow hose fits up in it real nicely, and I can attach any size tubing that I would want to work onto this, and my hand would still be turning the same size glass. So it just kind of makes my hand learn what it's doing in a different kind of way, because it's eliminating the variables of unstraight, unround, different sizes, and breaky. So I'm just going to puff out this end and then flatten it. I use the same size tubing, and because I left my tubing in my hotel, now I'm in a way that my hose is falling out of this 13 mil, but 1/2 inch medium works killer. I do smell some propane up here. So I blew that out and flattened it. I like to, when I make a petal or a leaf or something like that, I want it to be thin. So I just can't squish the glass as thin as I can blow it. It's never going to happen. And then once it's thin, I can't really cut it with the shears because it cools so fast, and then also it's fragile, so it breaks. So, you know, this is getting into the bit that Sally showed me about how to open the sides of the bubble with the flame rather than with a tool. Right now I'm just going to puff these sides out a little bit because they're totally flat right now. But most petals aren't totally flat. So I'm just puffing them out, and you know, starting some shaping now is easier than when everything's together. And I'm really not doing a lot, just a little bit. This would be really hard to do on a point, unless you had your blow hose on it, of course. So I'm just blowing the sides out really thin. Now blow some little holes, and then the flame can just open that thin bubble. And that top I'll just wipe apart. I'm going to heat back at the base here so I can move the pedal, what will be a pedal, away from the other one. Get a little more room. Now I can begin a process of kind of transferring the pedal from one end to the other as I prep it up into shape. One end has to be ready to be a connection, so it's going to be thicker at the base, coming to a termination with a little extra material, and that's going to stick onto the center of the flower. And then the other side is going to be thinner, rounder, and I'm not going to have that extra bit. So a lot of it is just kind of, each one of these pieces of prep always ends up a little bit different depending on, you know, what the bubble was like before I blew it and what, you know, how I opened the edges and how that came out and whatnot. Generally, I'm thinking this bottom side is thicker. And gonna be thicker than the top side. I try to keep it on center as I take it apart, and then I can always be building towards the shape I'm looking for from the beginning, and I do some wiping, some gathering, some stretching, just depending on what I need to do on each little piece of glass to get it to where I want it to be. So this is really wide at the top. I'm thinking I'll probably gather and stretch a little bit at the bottom, and then gather and stretch some of the material off the top. It's again, also it's thin, so I can't get it too hot, or it'll just gather so much that it won't be in shape anymore. So I'm working cold. I'm working in the end of the flame where the flame is soft and a tiny little bit feathery, so it's a little wider and it's just not happening so fast, so I can move everything into shape pretty slowly. Up here I'm going to need to do a little bit more, so I'm going to get it a little bit hotter. Roger's got this saying, lamp working is compensation. So when I was learning from him, he's a big kind of cup maker and teaches that, and a lot of the other glass blowers that I was admiring were teaching cup making as skill building, and I embraced that. The theory being, listening to Dante teach his class. Dante Marioni's an American glass blower who's very, very skilled, and he'd say, if you can make a good cup, you can make anything. And I was like, well, I want to make anything. I like cups. I want to make a good one, and that's what kind of led me to Roger to begin with. Was just I saw one of Cesare's cups, and it freaked me out. I picked it up, and I was like, oh man, the thing's so thin, but it's still so round, and everything looks right. I was like, how does he control the material when it's that thin? And it's something I really wanted to do. I don't know why then I didn't go to Cesare instead of Roger, but it just happened that way. I met Roger, and then I saw his work, and it's really thin, and he controls the material a lot. So, you know, I'm definitely not sorry in any way, but I've also got to see Cesare work, and he's really awesome too. So, I don't know what I was saying, something about cup making. Controlling the material when it's thin. So lamp working's compensation, right? So my thing is like, well, how do I compensate for the fact that like I'm not, you know, Roger's got 20 years of experience on me and I'm a student in his class. How do I compensate for the fact that I can't, my hands don't work like his hands work? How do I still blow the glass and get it to where I want to get and be able to do that? So one of my strategies that I came up with was to work slow and really carefully and cold. Because if you get the glass too hot, you know, and it goes south on you, you're starting over. You know, if you get the glass and it's not that hot, and you just kind of work your way along with it in baby steps, and you get to where you want to get, you know, and that was me. And then I was like, woohoo! You know, it turns out it's really slow way to work, and you know, maybe I don't advise it to my students necessarily, but one of my practices is get the glass just hot enough to do what you want it to do. Once it's hotter than that, once it's hotter than it needs to be to do what you want it to do, many things happen, and they can happen very fast, and they can happen too fast to control, and then you're starting over. So with these things also, I'm getting the glass just hot enough to do what I want it to do. And I think that's a good strategy, working thin, because you can't get the glass too hot. There's just not enough glass. There's so much heat here, even in this tiny little flame, you know, forget about it. It'll melt this down to a little nothing really fast, or not necessarily nothing, but it'll eat back into the shape that I'm trying to build, and then I won't, you know, then I will have to start over. So my process is already really slow. I don't want to start over, you know, ever, really. I want to just get done and have it be right. And if it takes a little bit longer, then so be it, if I get what I want. So that's a kind of basic petal prep. I also want to shape a little bit. So I can do that now. I can do some shaping when the petal's still, when it's all put together, and I will. But any bit that I can get done now, then if I have a problem, the problem is only with this petal. So, and I have others, right? But if I start getting going and doing a lot of shaping when the petal's already on the flower, and then I have a problem, well, then I gotta take the petal off, I gotta have a new petal, I gotta re-bridge all the petals so that I can assemble them and whatnot. So I try to do as much as I can before I get to the assembly point. And I'm just using a real light touch. The glass isn't, I'm not moving it very much at one time, but it's getting it to where I want it to be. And then, this is the basic of a petal prep. So that's how I would do a lot of those. So what I'm going to need to do now is I'm going to make a stem for the flower, because it will have a stem. So, this, when I was doing this project, the guy's like, oh, I want, flowers, 72 flowers, and then I know that they're fragile, so maybe some will lose in shipping or some will get mishandled or something, so I'm going to make some extras. Then I'm looking at, okay, I'm going to make 80 flowers, but I don't, and I want them to be complex, but I don't, kind of each step in this piece is designed to minimize my time commitment to it. So this kind of stem that I'm making is really simple. The same way that the petal is really simple. It's clear, it's roughly an oval. I didn't do anything to the surface of the glass. I didn't add anything. These bundles of stamens, the reason I bundled them is because, well, I know I'm going to want to put a lot, but if I can, each one I put on becomes 3, then I have to put on, divide by 3 the number I would put on. So if I put on 15 of these, but they're all look like 3, then it looks like I have 45. So rather than make 45 welds, I'm making 15. It cost me some time in prep, but I had a friend who's pretty talented, and she was helping me make these preps for this thing, so it enabled me to kind of be a little more efficient in the process. So I'm just going to get this hot, and then I'm going to use my Rigi mashers. I don't know what the Italian term for them is, but I'm sure there is one. They're these. They're mashers. They have Rigis. I love these. They're awesome. I'm a big fan of the Carladona tools. Jim Moore makes really nice Rigi mashers too. These ones have more Rigis. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I like them. And I'm not going to really try to, really what I'm trying to do with the Rigis is be able to make a stem with some texture on it, because, if you pick up even a smooth stem piece of plant, whatever it is, something little by the side of the road or in your yard, those are really the plants that I look to and work with, plants that are around me in my life. But if you pick it up, it's not smooth. There's none of them hardly, or maybe there's some, but most of them have some sort of texture, striation, something. So that's all I'm trying to do. I'm going to really rough this up with just a few squeezes so that when I stretch it out, it'll have a little bit of texture, and that's all I'm really looking for. I'm not trying to do anything super specific other than that. But I am going to need to stick a little punty on the end so I can stretch it out after I get my texture on there. The question was, do the Rigis run in the same direction as the handle? Yes, they do. Sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the question, and I haven't been doing that. So I want to put the Rigis on, the texture, but I don't want the thing to cool down. I want to get the texture on fast. I want to pick up the putty and then stretch it out, so I don't have to put too much heat. I'm obviously going to be cooling the glass quite a bit just with the cold tool. That's about all I need. I don't want it to be square, so I kind of pinch it a couple to be round-ish. I don't want to put so much heat on it that I'm going to melt away my texture. And I don't want it totally straight either. I'm just going to want to give it a little bit of action. And that's really all I need for my stem for this. And I'll let this cool and then take it off of the handle so that when I'm doing my connection, I can just be holding the stem. So that's, at this point I have pretty much all of my parts. I have my stamens, I have my petals, I have my stem. I need to make the center, which is going to kind of be what everything is attached to. So I'm going to use this. This is maybe like 8 mil, and I'm going to use this for the center of the flower. So, the same way that for the stem, I just wanted to give something to it without going crazy. I can go really crazy on cane work, on stems and stuff like that, but it's hard. I don't really do anything in 2 hours. I can eat lunch in 2 hours, no problem, walk the dog or something, but most of the work that I make takes, days or weeks or months or more. So it's hard to, it's a little, I'm like, 2 hours, what am I going to make? Can I make anything? But, so I'm just going to, I have this kind of bit of glass gathered up. I want to push it down into shape, but I'm going to use this texture plate. It's a little bit of a tool. When I was in Venice for my honeymoon, and my wife was generous enough to let me go to Murano and do some glass stuff and see people, and I'm like, oh, I gotta go to Carlo Donna and look at the tools, and then I got some tools, and there was a masher with this pattern on it, and I really liked the pattern, but I didn't really see mashing a pattern. So I asked Roberto Dona, who's the tool maker there, if he had a little piece of this, and he gave me this piece. So it was pretty nice of him. He's a real kind, generous dude. So just some real little, texture there. A lot of times or sometimes I can dot and really build, something special, but I don't always need that. So I'm gonna, what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to cold seal to the face of that, what will be the center of the flower. And that's gonna be kind of my position of working from. I just forgot a step. Before I do that, I'm gonna push a little Maria on this piece of glass, which is, maybe 6 or 7 mil. And that's going to give me a place to start my bridges or get my bridges to. It's also going to be a way for me to, that's good, to space the petals when I put them on, because I'm going to put 6 petals on this flower and, kind of 3 inners and 3 outers. I could mark the glass with like a Sharpie or something to show me where thirds are. Would be kind of one way to make sure that when I put on the petals that they kind of are well spaced and not like a small gap and a big gap, or a big gap and 2 small gaps. I want 3 evenly spaced gaps. So I'm going to come back after I get this cold seal on, and I'm going to put 3 little bridges off of this Maria. And I'm going to try to space those right, and it's really easy for me to adjust them a little bit if I need to. So then when I'm putting the petals on, after I put the stamens on, I can see where thirds are. I want to make sure the center is nice and warm. I don't want to melt in the things, but I don't want it to shock and be cracked when I take this cold seal off later. And I want a real light touch there because I want it to pop off easily. And I'd rather have it be too light and pop off, especially because in a little bit, all my bridges are going to be holding everything in place. And if that cold seal fails, it won't really be a big deal. But if it's too hot and doesn't come off, or if it's too hot and it cracks the center, then I got, different kind of problems. You can see I'm working the glass. My right hand is kind of underhand. My left hand is overhand. How are you guys taught? 2 overhands, 1 underhand, 1 under, 1 over. Roger was taught by a scientific glass blower, who was taught by a scientific glass blower, who was taught by a scientific glass blower. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with it. When I started working with Roger and I wanted to make these cups, I was working this way. That's how Bob taught me. Bob Snodgrass, my first teacher. Well, Roger said I couldn't blow glass that way. And I said, well, do I have to change? And he said, yes. And I said, well, if this guy obviously has what I want in terms of being able to do the kind of things that I want to be able to do, and I'm here paying money at Corning to take his class, I'm going to do what he says because he's my teacher. So I switched. And that was, it was challenging a little bit at the time, but I think it's, it's been worth it. And I think it doesn't, there's so many differences in technique. Everyone does something, a lot of people do different things. And, what works for someone might not work for someone else, or, what someone likes, I think there are strong reasons to turn with one hand under, but I think in general, it's not, I don't really have a dog in the fight. I do what I do, and anyone that does something different, as long as it works for you, perfect. It doesn't, that's fine with me. So, the same thing with the points and everything. Cesare pulls points. He manages to make really excellent work. So I think there's a million ways to skin a cat and a million ways to do something with glass. And as long as you're happy with the results and it's coming out well, then however you do it is the right way for you to do it. If it's not coming out well, then we can talk about how to maybe make it come out better if you're not happy with it. But other than that, I think people are, should do what they want. So now I'm going to start adding these little bundles, and I'm going to work my way around from one side to the other. I've got these little posts on there. Those are going to allow me to attach, get my bridge onto something. They're going to, the heat's isolated from this rod, so everything's going to stay together. And I'm going to switch my glasses. Now at this point, I probably am going to switch over to my other torch because I'm going to need it for the cleaning up the weld. So it's either, work on this one, then switch, or just work on this one. I think it's always good, as a flame worker, I want to have, one of the things that Bob told me that I remember, I remember a lot of things he told me, but one of the things in the beginning that he told me, maybe on the first day, was, if you go to an auto mechanic's shop and you look at their tools, they're going to have a screwdriver, but they might have 50 screwdrivers. They got Phillips heads and star drives, square heads, whatever. They're the big ones, small ones, medium ones, tiny ones, huge ones. Flame workers, what we have is our flame. That's our tool. I have these other things, but nothing would happen. I need the heat to make the glass move. So on a, and he showed me on a Carlisle, or maybe it was on a National, but he was like, so this is one size screwdriver, that's another, that's another, that's another, that's another. Every different flame is a different tool, and it can be appropriate to use for a different, something that I need a different heat. So every different flame is a different tool. So I have a lot of flames available to me at my bench. I generally have my CC Plus, a National, and one of these Smith little torches. Most of what I use are my CC burner and the Smith these days. If I'm doing like a larger scale sculpture, like some of the stuff that maybe some of you have asked me about, a lot of that I'll use either a National or Carlisle hand torch. They both basically are the same animal to me, but the Carlisle's way prettier, and I like pretty. It works for me, so I like to use the Carlisle's a little bit more than the National. So I'm coming all the way around this connection and making sure that it all flows together nicely. Because I'm using such a small flame, I can really isolate my heat and make sure I'm just getting the glass that I want hot, and not anything else. The way that the center bulges out here, it kind of makes a little overhang when I'm going to look at it from this way down. I'm not going to be able to see the connection anyway, unless I looked at it from the back, but I won't be able to see it from the back because there'll be all kinds of petals there. So this is going to be a hidden connection anyway, but it needs to be right. It needs to be strong. I know that someone's going to touch these parts possibly, and when they get touched, they'll probably break. And that's okay, but they can't just break off at the connection. It can't be like, oh, that was a shitty connection. It was like, oh, you touched something really fragile and it broke, but it was put together well. And I think everything in glass should be put together well, at least everything I make, because I care about it and I want it to survive. And I make things that are really, really fragile anyway and prone to breakage, but I don't want it to be broken because I did a poor job or even a fair job or whatever, not a good enough job. I need to make sure that when it comes back to me, you know, when I was making cups and starting to make cups, boy, it's really embarrassing to sell a cup and then someone's like, oh, I picked it up and the foot fell off. You know, I've been there, and that's not a good place to want to be. And I always, you know, I'm down to repair things and stuff like that, but if my work breaks, I want it to be someone else's fault. And that's really important to me, so when I put things together, I spend a lot of time making sure it's put together well, so that if it does come back to me broken, I don't feel bad about myself. Sometimes, like this one, I left a little too much space between the one and the other, so rather than try to like move it over and get it to where I wanted it to be, I'm just going to leave enough space there and then come back and put one in between. A little gap, so I'm just gonna bridge the bridge between my bridges. So just so I have something to talk about, I'm going to be doing like another 15 of these. It's all going to be the same for me and for you. But you know, some of you guys came up and asked me, hey, what are you going to make? How big is it going to be? And I was like, well, it's going to be a flower. It's not going to be that big. I do like to make things that are large. I like, you know, I have a very, you know, big interest in nature, and one of the things I love the most about nature is how small it makes me understand that I am and feel. So if I can get to that feeling in my work, then I'm really happy. And so scale is one way that I can do that, because if I make really big things, they make me feel small, and it's a lot of fun for me. So But I think that process, that what's called networking or cage working or the Anna Skipska style, or whatever it might be called, that's pretty a basic process. So there would only really be one thing that I'd be showing you guys, and basically it'd be a butt seal, which isn't very challenging, but it takes time. And that was one of, I remember, I was a student at Pilchuck, and the then director, came and said to me, "Oh, we see what you're doing, and we like it. I was making cups. Will you make some cups for this event we're having and donate them to us for this event?" And I was like, "Sure, yeah, I'd be honored." It was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And I was thinking, well, I was studying with Roger, and Roger works really big flame work stuff. He's got these huge long arms and hands, and he's just he can do things that would set me on fire, literally, because of just the function and the way his body is really really big. But I was thinking to myself, oh, I'm gonna make a big cup and come in there and show all these glass blowers what they can't do, because at the furnace they can make some really nice thin cups. We have the advantage, I think, as flame workers in thin, because for the most part you don't have to go back and reheat the whole thing in the hot glory hole where everything would just crumple. You can blow it paper thin and then leave it alone, and maybe just work the lip or whatever. So we kind of have that going for us. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna make a big cup, feel really special about myself or whatever. And then I went, and Anna Skipska had this 6 foot tall cup, and I was like, fuck, I'm never gonna make a 6 foot tall cup or whatever. But it really, it kind of put her work on my map, and that was really early in my work with glass. And she's a really, really nice woman, and has done a lot of very interesting work building in that way. And I really like her a lot. So I think without having seen her work, I might not have been interested in it as much. And then when it came down to when I started to use that process in my work, really it was after I took some drawing classes. And then it's very similar to drawing. It's just with glass, and it's really slow, because you can make a curved line on a piece of paper like that, but to make a curved line with a piece of rod and have it, that takes a lot more time. But really, it's not a complex process, but it's a very, very useful one, because you can build, and it's a way that I was, after playing around with it for a little bit, I was like, oh, well, I could make any shape I want in any scale with this process. So that's kind of interesting, and I think that's what got me going with that work. And I like that work, it's fun. This right now, it's upside down, or would be upside down. This is when it's done. It will be facing this way, but I have to build from the inside out, because if I started with the petals, then I'd have to get above the petals and try to put all these in, and the petals would get all beat up because they're pretty thin and they don't want any flame on them. So I work kind of from the center out. And that way, because right now, see how I'm putting the heat on the glass, and I can really be careful where my flame splash is going. Right now it's not that important, but the heat, the heat's gonna go up right now, and it's gonna rise. So if I had petals above it, they'd be getting hot. I'd have to be putting this flame under them, and then that'd be not the way I would want to do it. So this way I can really work and use my heat without having to worry about affecting anything else that I've done. And the same way, you know, once I start putting the petals on there, you can see I kind of have this gather. It's a little wider above the thing. The question was I looking at the flower upside down or right side up? So this wider area is where I'm going to put those petals. So when I do, they'll be a little bit isolated from these bits so that, you know, I'm not changing one thing. I don't want things changing. You know, when I'm done with this connection, I want to be done with this connection and not have to come back to it and modify it or do anything to it. The question was, do I keep building bridges for the stamens as I'm going? What I'm doing is I'm using the handle that I kind of leave this handle so I can pick up this bundle of stamens and then apply it without breaking it or getting my hand anywhere I don't want to. But then also I'm just bending down that handle to connect with these other bridges, and that it becomes my bridge. Does that make sense? Because if I had to stop if I put the thing on and then had to stop, pick up a bridge, add it there, that just takes longer. And I'm already, I don't fear time in my work, but I do try to make what I'm doing as efficient as possible so that I'm not wasting time. And if I can, multitask in any way, or, do 2 steps in one, anytime I can eliminate a step, then I'm saving time. So I like to try to find ways to do that. I'm just sticking it on, and then I can use the heat, warm it up, and get it to where I can move it. It's really challenging to try to hold and move and heat and do everything all at once with such a small little thing on such a tiny little, not even a connection yet. So just kind of getting it stuck on there and then manipulating it to where I want it to be, and then bridging it, and then making sure that fuse is good. This is a tiny little flame, but it's more than big enough to really burn the crap out of my fingers. It's very, very hot. Maybe one of you science guys knows the temperature of oxypropane flame, but it's over 4,000 degrees somewhere is probably pretty safe to say. 4,000 to 5,000 is really hot enough to hurt yourself. And even though this flame is tiny, it's still just as hot. It's not any less hot, it's just smaller. And it can go pretty far out. Right now I can feel the heat on the back of my hand. It's pretty hot, but it's not like hurting hot, but it's just about hot enough to burn the hair. So it's 6 inches away from the end of the flame almost, or 4 or something, but that's a lot of heat right there in a very small package. And they claim, I don't remember where I read this or something, but the makers of this torch claim and this is one of the biggest tips you can put on it, and there's also a pretty big flame, on this tip, but they say that you could weld a wire inside the paper that would be around a cigarette filter without burning the paper. So that's a really small hot flame. I've never tried that, so I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm a real big fan of this little torch.
What got you into glass?
I met Bob Snodgrass in Grateful Dead land when I was in college, and started seeing his glass and appreciating it. I don't know if you guys, most of you, I'm sure all the young people probably know. Who knows who Bob Snodgrass is? Let's see the hands. Yeah, there we go. Most people know, because Bob's super awesome, and I think really he's brought more people into glass maybe than anyone else. And that's a pretty fantastic thing. So he brought me into glass. I was aware of his work, and we had some mutual friends, and then the question was what got me into glass. Did I not say that or whatever? So that was it, really. We were friendly for a while, and then I was working for this guy in California doing some kind of seasonal work on his property, and I kept talking about, well, I really would like to go to Oregon and learn how to blow glass, but then I'd be like, I think I'm going to go see these girls in Santa Cruz. And after that being a pattern for a few years, I should go see Bob and get him to teach me how to glass. Well, maybe I'm just going to go to Santa Cruz. And this guy that I work for was like, you should go see Bob and learn how to blow glass. And I was like, okay, and I did. So that was, it was really nice to have people that care about you try to give you some good advice. So I was lucky to kind of get that encouragement. And then after starting working with Bob and really enjoying it, I decided, I wanted to do it full time. It was hard for me because I was, I'd go to Bob's and I'd work for a month, and I'd come home for a month, go to Bob's, work, come home. And that was cool, but I just wasn't progressing as fast as I would have if I was working full time, and I wanted to progress faster. But I really dug it, and I wanted to do it more. So I knew that if I moved to where Bob was, I'd be able to work more and learn more, and so I did. And I'm really glad. It's glass has been really an interesting and very rewarding part of my life. I've met a ton of great people. I really enjoy what I do on a daily basis. It's such a big material that there's so many possibilities to, and I kind of ran into that really quickly working with glass. Oh, here, Dave, I'll show you how to make, a milli. And then I'm making a milli. Wow, this milli stuff is great. This is really fun. I'm going to try to make a this. I'm going to try to make a that. I'm going to try to make another one. And then I'm like, I could spend my whole life making millis. This could be like a career. And then I'd be like, but I want to try to do one of these. And then I get distracted and make something else, and then something else, and then something else. So I've never been very faithful to a particular form or process in glass. I'm very curious about the material, and I want to try this, and I want to try that, and want to try something else, and that's really what I've done and still do. So I really enjoy it. It stays really fresh. One of the first rules Bob taught me about glass was it's supposed to be fun. So I try to keep it that way for myself, and if I'm excited about wanting to do something, I try to do it. And there's never going to be, I know that with this material, I'm never going to run out of things to learn. I'm never going to run out of things to try. I only have this one kind of lifetime to work with the glass, and you can, this is a material that would take many lifetimes to really master or understand, or you could master maybe one. That's a word I don't like to use particularly about myself. I feel very comfortable calling Paul a master of his technique, because he is. He's got 50 years, I've got 20, I know that I'm still a baby in my field, and my understanding of my material is growing all the time, and that keeps me really engaged with it. Because I'm trying to learn something. I'm trying to do something new, so it's exciting and it's fun. And when I go to work in the morning, I'm excited to start working because I want to try the next thing, or I want to finish the thing I'm working on so I can try the next thing, or whatever. I feel really fortunate to have gotten involved with glass. It's not a cash cow. Rogers always says, if you want to make money, be a banker. I think that's kind of solid advice. But then I talked to my friend who talked to my other friend who is a banker, and he was like, no, he's not doing that well right now. I'm like, really? I see his pictures on Facebook. He's got horses and like all this other kind of stuff. Seems like he's doing all right. But I think, it's important to me. I never really, I just want to make enough money to continue to do what I do and support my practice, and that's really just as long as I don't have to get a job like for some other guy or something. That sounds, that'd be it would be what it is. And there's a lot of cool jobs out there. And one of the things in glass that that's been part of my experience, I remember being at Pilchuck. This is probably 10 years ago, and they had an artist in residence there, Peter Shelton. He's a sculptor from California, and he was a really cool guy. And I was watching him talk about his work, and he was making these crazy, elaborate sculptures. He'd like build a house out of sheet metal and excavate a giant hole underneath, and then stand under it and take a picture. So you can see there'd be like a foot between the house and the ground level, and then he'd be in the hole under the house. So the picture would be of his head like under this house. And he's describing the work, and he says, well, this piece puts your head right at ground level, and you can look out at ground level, so it kind of turns your head into a cabbage, and I just thought it was hilarious, and he's like, this piece, he made like this huge bronze casting that's like 2 tons, or something like that, and it's in some very generic kind of cone shape, and it's suspended from the ceiling, but it had a gap where you could walk your head into it and then turn around. So he's got a picture of himself with this big cone in his face and this big metal object over his head. This thing makes it feel like you have 2,000 pounds all around your head, and I'm like, wow, this guy's fucking awesome. And then he's talking about his work, and he's like, when I was 34, I did 80 all-nighters. And I was like, oh, what? And I'm starting to do the math on that. So it's like every 3rd night, every 4th night, this guy's working all night. And I said to myself, I'm 47 now. I was probably 37 then. I'm like, this guy works harder than I do. I'm like, I want my career to continue. I better work harder. If I'm going to try to learn something from this guy, maybe that's what I need to learn. And I really kind of took that to heart. So, I work a lot, and one of the things, it's not, I really enjoy it, it's great, I love my work, but I'm married and stuff, so I like to hang out with my wife too, and I like to do other things sometimes and whatnot, but because this job, what I do, I don't have a job anywhere, I don't have a paycheck or a pension or anything like that. But I really, really love what I do. But it's kind of insecure a little bit. I'm still developing my career and building a body of work, and people are starting to collect some of it and whatnot. But I never know what's going to happen next year, next month, or whenever the money in my bank runs out, unless I know I have money on the way, which is pretty rare. So. What I need, what I've done, or what I said to myself is, look, I don't know where this is going to go, but I really, really like it. And if I, I've been doing it for however long, 15 years, or now, 20. I'm in my 21st year. But if I had to wake up in the morning and say, I need to get a job, I don't have enough money, I can't support myself. I could live with that, I could deal with that if I didn't then have to go and say, well, if only I'd worked a little bit harder, maybe I could have made it, or something like that. So, I've just been working really as hard as I can so that if the day does come or could come or whatever, when I said to myself, no, now I have to go get a job, I wouldn't feel bad about it because I worked as hard as I could and I tried as hard as I could, and that, that's really important to me. So I guess if I had to go get a job, I wouldn't be too worried about it. I wouldn't be stoked necessarily unless it was an awesome job. But if you can only do what you can do, and if I try my best and it doesn't work out, then so be it. I'll do something else. It's not like, I think we're all really, really fortunate, all of us in here anyway, because we have time to blow glass or look at people blowing glass or learn how to blow. These are things that only fortunate, very fortunate people have the time to do. Some people, have to worry about, maybe they live in a war zone or maybe they have no food, stuff like that. Those are real problems that, I think we're mostly really fortunate to not have to deal with. So I feel really fortunate in general. I love what I do. It's really fun. I get to come to New Jersey and talk to you guys and make flowers and whatever else. See friends, make new friends, see old friends. It's a good gig. I recommend it. But it's not easy, and it's not a cash cow. Don't get into it for the money. Or if you do get into it for the money, don't try to make things like this because there's you'd be bummed. Alright, so I got all those guys on there. I'm going to move to the pedals. These go a lot faster because I'm just putting 6 of these on. Now before I want to put them on, I want to get some heat. I want to get some nice even heat around this area that I've just been really slowly putting a hot spot, putting a hot spot, putting a hot spot around this piece of glass. The glass can tolerate that, particularly this boro, but it doesn't mean it's really happy about it. I'm sure there's a pretty good amount of stress in there. So rather than worry about the stress, I'm gonna take some stress away from it before I move forward. So it's a little bit of a step. I'm adding a step, but it's probably only 30 seconds or so. I'm not gonna get the glass hot that I just got hot, but I'm kind of away from it. I'm letting the flame splash heat that up. I'm letting the little bit of convection that happens with this material get a nice even heat to all those little areas that I just worked very hot. And at this point I feel pretty comfortable about it and I can move on to putting these petals. So you remember I'm going to do 3 and 3. So the first 3, and I'm going to look to these bridges that I put on to where, where's a third, and where's a third, and where's a third. Generally, I want the petals to lay together pretty flat, but I do like some shaping in the petals. So the petals with more shape I'll put, that'll be on the inside, because they won't really be touching up on anything, and then the flatter petals I'll put on the back side so that I can have them really close to the inner one, so there's not like a gap in that spacing. So I can't put these right where I want them to be at the end, because I'm going to need some room to clean up the ends of the stamens without heating up the petals. So I'm going to leave them out about that much so that I can kind of get my heat in here without hitting the petals. But again, the handle becomes the bridge, and I can just kind of drop that right down into position, connect it to whatever's closest to what I need. And then I'm just going to let that chill up a bit and then work my connection. I put a lot of the heat into into this gather rather than into that little bit of glass. And again, I'm going to let the flame splash and the convection kind of work its way up into that little nib on the end of the petal. Because the petal coming out of that little part I leave for the connection is really thin, and that can gather and change shape right down here, and I don't want that to happen. I forgot to look at my little things before I put it on. I'm going to go to the middles. I like to let gravity just move the thing because I am on a very weak connection right there. And if it's cold and I go in and try to manipulate it, then it can break off. A lot of times it might break off that little nib, in which case it would be good to have extra petals sitting up there rather than have to stop at this point and reshape the bottom of the petal. So I try to be really gentle. Obviously I'm not building, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make the thing as strong as it can possibly be. But, if you look at it, I'm not building it for strength. No matter what I do, this is going to be a very fragile piece of glass. I do like a lot of testing, and I'll show you like my little my shake test that I do with stuff to make sure that it can survive shipping and whatnot, because that's important. But I came to a point a long time ago. I remember I was making this orchid brassia with a long kind of droopy petal things, and I took the piece out of the kiln after it was all assembled, 8 flowers on a hollow stem. And I looked at the thing and I was like, what is wrong with me? I'm like scared to take it out of the kiln without breaking it. Why would I think that this is a good idea to make this and try to send it out into the world and expect that it wouldn't just get broken the first time? And that's been a real something that I've had to deal with breakage and try to figure out strategies to minimize breakage, and packing techniques and all these things are really important. But at that point I decided I don't care. Glass is fragile, and sometimes they bounce and sometimes they break, and no matter what it is, it's glass, it's fragile. So rather than design away from fragility and change the aesthetic of what I'm trying to make, if these were on 5mm connections or 4 or 3 or whatever, beefy, or if everything started looking beefy, then it would have a real beefy look to it, and that's not what I want. So I am going to try to make things to be what I want them to be, and if they are fragile, then so be it, That's still what I want to make, so I'm going to just deal with it and accept it and say, well, whatever. One of the things that I've done is, in general, if someone buys my work, they get my lifetime guarantee. If anything breaks on this piece and I'm still alive, I'll fix it. If it was my fault. If you drop it on the floor and it breaks, I'll fix it. But I'm gonna send you an invoice. But if something just happens, if it's fragile and can't stand up to just existing, I'll fix it. So and if I can build it, I can fix it. And you know, I've always kind of had that approach to how am I going to deal with fragility, and it's definitely been an issue. I've had, you know, work in shows and they didn't sell well, and I say to the gallerist, well, do you think it's because the stuff is so fragile? And he says, yeah, possibly, probably. And I say, oh, okay, well, oh well. You know, that's the way it, you know, not everything is I try to build them to last, but I'm not going to design away from them being fragile, because part of the beauty and mystery of life is how fragile everything is, you know? Like, we are super fragile, our bodies, you know, we might feel strong, or, you know, and we might have years of strength, and then, you know, we're gonna come up to, you know, we're not very sturdy. You know, a rock is a pretty sturdy thing, but a living being of any sort, whether it's a plant or an animal or what, fragile, you know? And even the planet is pretty fragile, you know? It's durable, it's gonna be here for a long time. It's been here for a long time as a boiling ball of rock, and, you know, an ice cold frozen rock. You know, these are all kinds of things that this planet has been and will continue to be for a long time. But the living, breathing, beautiful, life-supporting place that is unlike anything else that we can find in the universe at this point, you know? We can say, well, the probabilities are there's other places like this. Yeah, probabilities are cool, but not as cool as this is the only one that we know of. It's certainly the only one I know of, and even the people that know about these things, it's very special. And, you know, and behind that huge amount of specialness is us, you know? So I really appreciate the fragility of nature, and fragility in general, and I'm not scared of it. So those are some of my thoughts on fragility. Now, because, you know, I put those, you know, bridges in, those 3 bridges off of the piece of whatever 7 mil at the beginning to help me space these petals, and then the first one I put on, I forgot, you know, I ignored that thing that I did to help myself. So now I'm kind of, you know, I'm suffering behind that a little bit, or trying to compensate for that. You know, my spacing is a little bit off. I still need to get these attached, and then I can come back and tweak my spacings a little bit, but you know, I'm seeing that is a thing that's happening right now that I'm thinking about and trying to deal with a little bit. Perfection is like an interesting thing that I you know, I think a lot of people think about, and some people talk about, you know, this, not, you know, about glass in particular, you know, like, oh, you know, someone's perfected their technique, or perfected, this is perfect, or something like that. I don't believe in perfect for things that, you know, in general people do. I think, you know, perfect is in nature. You know, that's where we can see perfect. A tree, you know, flower, lake, rock, you know, the sun, things like that can be perfect, but, you know, certainly my glass can't be. And I've never, you know, I've been around a ton of really, really talented glass blowers that, you know, people would say are, you know, the world's best. And none of them really talk about perfect too much either, you know. I remember listening to Dante talk about cup making, and he's like, yeah, you're never going to see a perfect cup. And he's like, and maybe I've made one, but it might be like 1 in 1,000. And if I did make one that I could see that, I would never send it to the store. You know, you give it to your mom or something like that. So it or your wife, girlfriend, whatever. It doesn't go out into the world. So that was really helpful for me as a young glass blower, especially trying to work in these forms, the cup form, goblets. You know, they're very traditional forms with really kind of very serious standards of what they should be, could be. Roger had a 2 millimeter rule. If it's off by 2 millimeters in a matching set, if one's 2 millimeters taller, it's not a matching set anymore. And I could see that, when I was trying to do that work, if this part is 1 millimeter off of what I wanted it to be, it can make the cup a second, and that was really hard to, work to that level, which I think is really part of why the cup making process is so good for skill building, because there are those rules, that people know about, and then you have to kind of, work to those rules. So, the collectors know, the glass blowers know, maybe just the collectors and the glass blowers, but that's a lot right there. So, I don't expect to ever make anything I think is perfect. I definitely never have. There's always room for, I think, well, it could have been, next one I'm going to try to not have this or not have that, or it could be a little more this or that. There's always something. And then when I was learning and trying to learn and looking at people's cups and other people's, God, I really want to be able to do that. Once I started seeking them out and knowing enough about them to really scrutinize them and look for any minor imperfections, you can always find them. So that actually made me feel a lot better. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this guy's really awesome, but they're not perfect either, Maybe you guys can get perfect in lab glass sometimes, but I think there's always tolerances, and tolerances mean, change from what's on paper to what you're looking at, because it's really hard to be super, super, super dead on, accurate, exact, It's just really a challenge for a person to be perfect. I don't know. Like I said, I don't really believe in it, but I don't think it's necessary either. I think well-made is necessary. Like I said, I like pretty, works well for me, but interesting works really well too. And I think about art, it's not about what anyone else thinks. It's about, the artist and their intentions. And if you're trying to make something and you're happy about it, then that's great, and that's as good as it has to be, or maybe as good as it can be. And then, once you move out it, but it has, things need to be well made, so they're not just falling apart, and you can't, you don't want someone looking at your thing and going, yeah, that's a terrible seal, that's, you're not going to get ahead that way, people are going to see that. There's a lot of, I remember doing a demo at Pilchuck, and I was probably making a cup, and then I had someone standing watching me and talking to me, and then I was finished with the cup, and they were like, wow, that cup's really good. And I was like, yeah, maybe it's okay, And they were like, no, the thing's great. And I was like, yeah, really not so much. It's not, it's just okay. And they were like, well, but to an untrained eye, I'm like, there's a lot of trained eyes around here. Like to an untrained eye, it really doesn't, it works great at grandma's house or something like that. But when you're out, in this world of glass, there are a lot of trained eyes. So I think it's important to make your work well, whatever it is, even if it's not, about technique, whatever it is in this material in particular, because it can fall, it can crack, If you don't have your heat right, maybe it'll crack. If you don't have your heat right and your process right, maybe it'll fall apart. And those are real issues if you want to live by selling work and you're making work that's cracking and falling apart. It's going to be really tough to have a career that way. But again, it's part of what makes glass really interesting. I think it's a very unique material. Besides its properties, the whole fluid to solid thing, that's pretty unique right there. The whole transparent thing, that's pretty awesome too. There's just so many things, and you can't touch it. Right now I could, but it's just a really challenging material. It's a real interesting material. I think there's a lot of room, and it's a very new material. Glass was in the lab for a little while, It was in the, in the factory for longer than that, because, like we know from Diane's talk and before, people have been working with glass for a long time. But for an individual person to be able to have a furnace and just make what they want, or to have a little studio and make what they want, a torch in your house or shop or garage, and just make things out of glass as an individual, that's very new. Like to, 50 years new, 60 years new, where you're not like in the factory. Those guys in the factory in Venice, they might have a couple minutes, like occasionally, to play around, but they weren't making what they wanted. They were making what the factory owner and the designer told them to make. They were making production work, So this whole idea of being an artist with glass is really a very new thing. So that also makes it very interesting and exciting and kind of special also. So, I'm going to have to come back and, a little bit of changing around those, maybe adjusting the spaces between those petals, but I can't do it until my bridges are off. So I'm going to connect the flower to the stem, then I'm going to handle all my bridges and try to do any little bit of adjustments that I may or may not be able to or want to do, and then I'll be pretty close to the end. So I'm going to do this connection from the stem bit to that flower bit. I kind of paddled a little bit with my tag, the back end there. I'm taking a little bit of material off of the end of the stem because I don't really, I'm going to have some untextured glass between the bottom of the flower and the top of the stem, but I don't want much.
Gosh, you gotta go.
I'm okay with them. I don't have a whole lot of room between getting heat on the backs of the petals, but luckily, they're really thin, so they're pretty tolerant of being heated because there's not like a whole bunch of glass there that part of it's getting hot and part of it's not getting hot. That's going to create, thermal strain, and then that's how I'm going to get a crack. On these petals, they're really thin, so if they're getting hot, all of a sudden the whole thing's just hot. So thin glass is very forgiving from thermal strain because things are heating up evenly just because of the density of the material. So I'm just shaping this a little bit, getting a little bit of angle. Sometimes I would come and I would bridge from here to here and then get back with my torch to, maybe I just will for the hell of it. For the heck of it. So this little bridge here just immobilizes that stem so that I can come in and heat up my connection and smooth it out and use gravity to have some places, there's like a little bulge here, a little dip there, and I can just let the glass flow from the bulge to the dip kind of thing, or just kind of get it all how I want it to be without worrying about the stem flopping this way, flopping that way, developing wrinkles or getting, just making it harder for me to do what I want to do. So being able to immobilize the stem really makes this process a little bit easier. You can use the neck of the torch tip to be a little tool to just kind of change the shape a little if I need to. So that should about do it. I know that I'm getting close to my time here, so I don't want to belabor. So I don't want to, I'm not going to chop it with the tool right now. Everything's together. I really want to be gentle. So I'm going to heat this up, disconnect this part of the bridge. Do the same here. And then I'm going to start taking apart my bridges and whatnot. And the first part of that is going to be taking this handle bit that I'm holding in my left hand off. I'm going to start now just holding the flower by the stem. I'm going to avoid those parts that are hot and just mostly get this thing out of my way, and then I can start taking those bridges off and just taking all this assembly apart to get down to the actual thing. So I've got it off. Ow! Don't grab the hot part. I can smell my finger flesh right now. So I'm being a little careful with my left hand too, because below here is hot and above here is hot, but I'm holding it right by the sweet spot. And I'm just going to keep picking away at these bridges. So I think I said something before about people were asking me to make something big. Making the big stuff is so much easier than this. Did I say that already? Okay, good. You guys can all figure that out. That's not a challenge. Just butt seals, rod bending, and time. Which is really the hardest part, because it's hard to figure out how to make your life work if everything you do takes a ton of time. And that's just something I've been working on for 20 years, so kind of figured out some ways to make it happen. So at this point, all of my bridges to the center bit are off. This bit of gather that I'm using to pick stuff apart is getting a little big and getting in my way. Knock that off. Okay, or not. But I want to take this center part off because that thing's really in my way and needs to go. And if you remember, it's a cold seal, so it should just pop off real nice. And that's what I'm going to hope for. I want to make sure that this part is hot. Before I bonk it off, I want this part to be real hot because I don't want it to break there and fall down and break these other things off. But if it just kind of carries off like that, that was a good one. So now I still have to clean up all the rest of these bits because they're 3 coming down into 1, here 20 times. But I want them all to end up as individuals. So I'm just going to start kind of heating up and removing extra material. I kind of, after, most of the times after I take away material, while it's still hot, I'm using the body of the torch nozzle here to flatten this down, because if I have a bunch of pokey parts that I'm trying to pick up something, it picks up unevenly. But if it's flat, I can kind of melt back to a certain point, grab it all, and take it away. And it's only going to move back to where the heat allows the glass to move. And beyond that, it's cold. So I'm just kind of going to work my way around these stamens, or what, ish. And until I have them down to the level where I want them to be, which is going to be lower than they are. So I'll probably take a couple passes as I just continue to remove material. And then once I get it down to where I think I'm happy, then I'll stop and just ball up the ends. Mostly because this type of flower, it seems like it has little balls on the ends of the stamens there, and there are probably words in botany for what those balls would be, but I'm not sure exactly what they are right this second. Anthers, maybe, or somewhere that pollen comes from. And I've left the ends of the petals with those little connection points. They're still poking out because I don't really know still. There could be a situation where I would need to punty back up to those, and if I had to take one off and put one back on, if one cracked or something like that, I still could need those attachment points. So those are going to come off last. And I'll smooth the edges of the petals, not really smooth, but get rid of those points out at the end. Okay, so I'm pretty close. So I'm gonna say these are about as low as I want them to be, whether that's the truth or not. Maybe I'll just go a little bit more. Okay, now I'm going to just gather them. And this part's a little bit tricky because they're pretty close together. Some of them are really close together, and I don't want them to stick. And I can, if they, like I said, if they do get stuck, I can come back, heat below the parts that are stuck, come back with my shears and trim them apart, but that's a pretty touchy little move, and I would definitely prefer not to have to do it. So I got it kind of started. Now I'm going to use the little torch just to address each one. And this way I can use gravity so that while I'm heating this one, I'm making it fall back. While I'm heating that one, I can make it fall in and stuff like that. The question was, when I'm spending time outside, is this the kind of detail I notice, how some fall in and some fall out? I, nature's really uniform and very in its ununiformity. So sometimes, and it's also a rough place for a flower to exist, really. There's wind and rain and bugs and, tagged one. All kinds of things that can change the individual flower for, whatever, one reason or another. So, I think the best way for me to answer that question is to say that most of the time when I'm making a flower or any kind of plant, I really want to have that plant right there with me on the bench as a model, because these aren't my shears. They were like feeling super clunky, but I got it. I like to have the plant right there so I can look at it. And I know that, when you look at the work of the Blaschkas, that was like kind of 2 lifetimes of work is represented there. They definitely did other things, the invertebrates and whatnot, but they had a mandate. Their job was to make botanical models, and they did it so well that, as far as I'm concerned, in glass, that's been done, and no one's ever going to do it better than them. And why would you even try? Because they did it so well. But what I try to do in general is, I love working with glass. I want the material, I want the piece to be glassy, so I use a lot of little kind of glassy techniques that aren't really natural on my flowers often. But one of the ways that I approach them is to say, okay, no matter where I look on this plant, there's going to be more detail than I can really, I could try to get it, I could go there or something like that, but the lengths that you'd have to go to get all of the detail that I see, extreme lengths, and they went to those lengths, and it's beautiful. And I totally appreciate it. That's not me. I'm not going to do that. So what I try to do is I try to add a little bit of detail everywhere, so that no matter where you look, there's a little more to look at. And then as it goes up, so the petals have a little waviness to them. The things have little balls on them. The center has a little texture to it. This guy has some texture to it. Everything is simply done, but in the whole, it adds a lot of richness, and that's kind of more of what when I'm thinking about those balls, I'm not thinking about them as I'm trying to mimic the flower, even though the flower has that, but that's a real accessible detail for me to add, because it's just gathering up that little end, and it kind of happens anyway. So that's really more of what I look for, is what can I get here in a manageable way that's going to add to the piece without trying to make me crazy. So I think I look more for that than for what's really happening. I try to pick from what's happening to give my work as much as I can without doing more than I'd want to. And I don't think that's laziness, and maybe that's just my opinion, but I'm going to stick to it. You do have to draw a line somewhere. That's the thing, so it's like when I'm looking at a plant, I can know that, Blaschka or not, no person can make this plant better than the plant itself. They're so beautiful, and they're alive, and they grow. Try to do that. Forget about it. It's like that's not something humans can do. So, I start with knowing, okay, I got to draw a line somewhere, and then it's just really, I just want to be able to try to appreciate the form and enjoy the process, and try to have, I feel like I talk about the most simple things in my work, but they're also the most important to me. So it ends up possibly not being a very interesting conversation, but it's really what I'm into. So I just try to care a lot about what I see because, you know, and I had a thing not that long ago, and I'm not going to say with, but it's someone important in my life and my work and my business. And we were talking about, you know, some of the things I do, these paintings that I've been doing with the Frick, and they were loving like this portrait I did of my wife, and then I was showing them, you know, these other pieces and this other piece I want, you know, pieces that I was thinking about doing, and they were like, yeah, you know, the portraits, there's just so much narrative and they're so rich in that and stuff like that, and these other ones are just flowers, right? And I'm like, well, you know, yeah, just flowers, you know, we all live on just flowers. There would be no food, there would be no air, there would be, you know, there's oxygen in it anyway, you know, all of the things that really support us in the most basic ways on this planet are basically just flowers and stuff like that, just air, just water, you know, so I don't think it's just, to me it's like everything, and that's, you know, that's really what I'm trying to talk about and appreciate and really, you know, think is so awesome. And we're super lucky to just be able to experience, you know, life is not it's fleeting, you know, in flowers and in people, and you know, those are what I'm interested in talking about more than rendering a plant in botanical detail. Long answer. So I'm getting really close. I'm just dropping these petals back down. You know, I couldn't have taken, if these petals were up here, I wouldn't have been able to get to these dots without heating up the petals. It probably would have been problematic. So I'm just bringing them down to where I want them. I was using like 1/2-inch medium wall for making these petals. The question was what size was the tubing I used to make the petals. I think it was actually something a little beefier than most of the medium wall I usually use, and it was something that was just on my glass supply, and you know, the wall is too thick to use as a blowhose, and I was like, this will be perfect. But it really depends, and that material that I was using, that heavier wall 1/2-inch, was really too much, and a lot of them were blowing out small, so I was like compensating by working, just making a little tiny bubble. You know, I think it doesn't really matter as long as it's more about like how much of the material are you going to heat up and use. So I'm just trying to, you know, right now I'm dealing with the thing of like I didn't leave my spacing right, so I have like the gap here. I like them all to overlap a little bit, so I have a lot of overlap here, no overlap there. So I'm just heating it up and letting gravity kind of help me manage my spacing. And I'm really close to done. I just have to come back, and it's hard for me to quit these things, but I want to come back and just give the edges of the petals, bring them a little more shape. And again, because they're really thin, I don't, you know, I'm not preheating this petal to get back in there and manipulate it. I can just kind of go in there and do it because the glass is really thin, so it tolerates the change. You know, it's heating up really fast all the way through, and it's very forgiving for, you know, my being a little bit rough with it right now, which is nice. I see one tiny little adjustment I want to make back around this other side, and then I'll try to call it quits. Okay, this is the last adjustment I'm gonna make. And I never want these petals to be touching because, you know, the glass is gonna shrink, it's gonna expand a little bit with heat. I don't want any mechanical strain on this glass ever. So by not having them touching each other, then they're each kind of on their own and one's not going to be pushing against another one to stress it out. So I'm kind of, you can see I'll let the petal drop away a tiny little bit and then push it back up to where it's touching and then pull it back out. Just a little bit. It doesn't need to be much, but just like a hair, you know, or if I could like slide a piece of paper between the two petals without having them stick or without having the paper get stuck. Sometimes it's hard to get my eyeball like right to the gap in between. So if I let it to where I know it's kind of resting there and then I push it back up a tiny little bit, then I know that it's not touching. So I'm just going to put a little bit of heat in the center here. Oftentimes I might propane it out and just get the whole thing warm, but I'm not going to put this in a kiln, and I want you to, I want to just leave it up here for you guys to look at, but I want it to be safe. So I'm just going to put a nice even little bit of heat down in the area I was just working, and then call it done. This end, sorry. I can't leave that with like that hot little bit. And what I like to do to this end is just snip it because I'm a gardener and I like to cut flowers a lot. You know, I make bouquets and put them in the house. I like to grow a lot of flowers. So for these little guys, I was just kind of cutting them on an angle like I would if I picked it out of the garden. And then that's how I would leave it. Try that again. Thanks, Glasscraft, for letting me use your shears. All right. Questions? Anyone have any questions I might answer?